Hi, welcome to Living Waters, falling deeper in love with God's Word.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Lauren Cruz, and this is my co-host.
I'm Stephanie Pavlantos, and welcome.
Welcome. I'm kind of excited. Today's a new day.
It is. We have this book that we're going to start talking about today. So we are just going to start on, Lauren is going to start on the actual introduction to it before we start in any of the letters.
Right.
But we're going to talk a little bit about the book first with Lauren. So,
Right.
and if you guys have questions, please put them in our comments alongside the show. We can see, we can see most of the questions. So, there's also a producer chat on Lamb Network that I think you can also ask questions on. So if you have a question about the book or for Lauren, please put it on there. So welcome today. And so Lauren, I guess my first question is, I saw on Facebook that it was 6 years ago that you began this process. You have a picture
Right.
of a different cover,
Right.
and I think it was it was almost done, or if not.
Yeah, I tend to do things a little differently as a writer. I don't pitch my books until they're pretty much done.
Okay.
They still need a ton of editing and cleaning up, but a lot of people will pitch the concept of a book and then, maybe write the first or second, chapter. And then once they get a contract, they'll start writing. But I tend to do it different. I write first, and
Right.
yeah, which is kind of why, like, I have another book coming out, but it's been 3 years since my last book. And so a lot of people will think, well, what have you been doing in 3 years? Well, I've been writing that book and, researching and getting it done. So yeah,
And it does help the process, because when it's finished, I mean, mine was finished in 2020, Jewels of Hebrews, and then I got it published that same year because it was done.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. It can definitely go a little faster. Yeah. It's a long if you do traditional publishing, it takes years between the pitch and the publication. So
Right. You can, take
it's a
3 or 4
thing.
years.
Yeah, it's a long time. So yeah.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
how'd you get the idea to do this book with,
Mhm.
with these letters, with the strength of the woman?
Mhm.
Because I think you actually had, if I remember correctly, you had a door on your first,
Right.
and so
Yeah. So I did go to seminary. I did study Hebrew, and I will say the process of what this book offers is not generally taught in seminary. I learned about the imagery of the Hebrew letters after seminary, and a friend of mine who actually she went to the same seminary. We happened to work together, and we were both teachers, and she's like, the Proverbs 31 is an acrostic poem. I'm like, I never even heard of that. And she goes, yeah, it relates to the letters. And so, I mean, she said that, and I took off.
yeah.
And we originally were going to write the book together because she was a language major. Her major was in languages, and so she gave a ton of books, just like you. And, I just started inhaling this information, and we were going to write it together. And she just had a different vision. She wanted it to be more of an academic type book. And I'm like, no, it applies to women. I wanted it to be more of a women book. And she ended up moving. And when she moved, she's like, you know what, you can go ahead. She kind of gave me her blessing to keep writing, and it just changed. I don't know if she ever published or did her thing, but and so I took a year to write this book. I've never been a writer. In fact, writing and studying and stuff I do have a learning disability. It was diagnosed way back in the 70s, a slow learning disability. But honestly, the more I've learned about dyslexia, I think it may have never had an official diagnosis, but I see things funky when I read. I have a hard time reading aloud. As a teacher, it's terrible because I write things backwards, and my students, yeah. So I never thought I'd be a writer, because that was a very difficult thing. But I did. I wrote this book, studied. It actually was 100,000 words, which is way too big for a book. And
Wow.
so I had to edit after I
You
finished
had a
everything.
cut.
Yeah, I got cut. And actually, I tell this to writers all the time, don't ever delete anything you have, because all of that information that was cut is now this next book. It's
Right.
part of the next book. So that's the process. But I went to this writing conference. My only prayer was like, God, I just want to know that I haven't wasted this year of writing, because writing is hard. It's very isolating and,
And time consuming.
time consuming. And, I sat in the office a lot and didn't have time with family and friends that I would have liked because I was writing. And the way he answered that prayer was just shocking to me. Just
Wow.
never in my life thought it was a real thing. But yeah, that's how I started doing it. And then at the time, I really didn't even have a strong outline of how I was going to present this book. But in the process, I was blogging, and God would say, hey, that lady reminds me of that letter. And so on my blog, I was writing stories of how women fulfilled letters of the Hebrew alphabet, through their actions. And at a certain point in time, because they kept telling me it's too academic, you have to tell stories. I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to tell stories.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit just whispered to me, and he goes, you already have some of these stories. Go back and look at these women's stories. You have them. And so that's how the stories of the women were linked, because not only do I look at each of the verses, each of the Hebrew letters, but I link them to a story, that they're real people.
And they are beautiful stories.
And I didn't know all of them at first. Some of them are lifelong friends. Like there's a story about Stacy. She's been my friend since 6th grade.
Wow.
My mom is in here. My sister's mentioned, so I mean, some of the folks I did, but honestly, a lot of the stories are people I just prayed. I'm like, okay, God, I need you to bring women into my life that emulate the qualities of this passage. Like I need their stories. And some of them shocking, and we'll get to, some of them I can't even, like, I can't make this stuff up.
Right. Oh no, I understand that.
It fit beautifully, they fit beautifully with with the process.
It was the same way with the jewels in mine. I was amazed how they all fit. So yeah, I mean, and that's a God thing. So when something like that happens.
Right.
Lori had a few comments here.
Thank you. It's not too, I tried. That took a lot of editing, Lori. My next book is very deep too. And my whole prayer is just like, please just let the editor accept it. Please just let them accept, because I don't know. I don't have any more stories.
Right. And I wanted to show this. I have this complete Jewish study Bible.
Yeah.
And I came across this the other day and like, oh my goodness, Lauren would love this. But there they do. This is Proverbs 31, and you can see all the letters and the whole. I know it's not a very good picture, but
that.
Yeah, they separated it into that acrostic, and I thought that was cool.
I love it. I love it. Love it. Love it.
And it actually says in here too, because maybe you could tell, why is it the strength of a woman,
right,
when we read, who can find a capable wife, or who can find a wife of what is it? An excellent
valor, or woman of excellence, right?
So where did you come up with your title for this?
I'm going to give you a spoiler for next week, but Proverbs 31 in Hebrew, if you read it in Hebrew, it starts out, the phrase is woman of strength, who can one find? Or who it's, so the first letter is Ishet, which is woman of Chayil, which is strength. So the word that we have translated as excellent or valor or, virtuous. I mean, there's a lot of different ways it's been interpreted, is actually the Hebrew word for strength, Chayil. And it's only used a few times in the Bible. So we're totally going to go over this again next week. But Chayil is talked to about the Proverbs 31 woman and Ruth. And I'll tell you in a little bit why I think there's a parallel there. So Ruth and Proverbs 31 are the only two women in the Bible called Chayil. Chayil is always a word that's used to describe armies. And the phrase David's mighty men, we know that from the Old Testament. Well, mighty is Chayil. And so
Yes.
David's strong men, David's men of valor. So
Right.
it's always linked to armies, that kind. So that's why she's called a woman of strength. And it references strength. Strength is referenced in that passage, I think 7 times, if I can remember correctly. So Hebrew has a few different words for strength. Chayil, Ezer is another one. That's help. Ezer is help. But Oz is strength, and it's in there a lot. And we don't know it because we see it in English. But even in English, there's a verse that says she makes her arms strong, that kind of thing. So it's referenced in there often. And there is an underlying theme in there of this military woman. There's tons of references to the military.
Right.
So that's why she's the woman of strength, or strength of a woman.
Yes. And I think it's interesting too, because if you talk to most women and you ask them, are you a Proverbs 31 woman?
Right.
No way.
My grandma was. Right. I'm going to ask that. And so I see we have a couple of Shonda and Lori, a few people mentioning. So I'm going to jump on. I'm going to start one of the questions in the back of the book. So every chapter has just a few little study questions. So right after your heroic hymn, which is the chapter we are going to discuss today, I ask, what are your initial thoughts before we even jump in? What are your initial thoughts of the Proverbs 31 woman? So if our listeners want to type in, what did you think of before you even started this book or heard anything we discussed today? If someone said you're a Proverbs 31 woman, what would be your initial thoughts? Because I actually did that. I asked that question as I started writing my book. I took a poll and I mentioned it in my book. What are your thoughts of Proverbs 31? And so I'm curious. Type in your responses. The responses I got from a variety of women that I asked was not me. She is someone that my grandma was. My grandmother was a great example of a Proverbs 31 woman. It's not me.
Right.
Some people thought that it was a standard, or it was held over our head as, it's always taught on Mother's Day. Like, you need to be this Proverbs 31 woman.
And it's unattainable.
So, super, super hard. Yeah, Lori says, I'll take it as a compliment. Me too. I would take it as a compliment now. Right. I would roll my eyes, or anytime, oh, here we go again, Proverbs 31. And I understood that, writing a book on Proverbs 31, I had to overcome that. Oh, not another one,
Right.
So
it was intimidating, I think. And I think a lot of women don't even want to read it because it's kind of like, oh, something I can't do here.
Right.
And I can't be this person. And, but yeah, I mean, I think what your book has done is make it attainable.
Yeah.
And we see ourselves in it.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to really include the stories of these ladies. There's 20 stories, 20 out of 22 of real women. I mean, if I can get them, I'll have them join us on StreamYard. But if you met them in the thick of it, they would say you would never, even as a church person, I would judge and say, you could never be the Proverbs 31 woman because look at your life. And I'll tell you, I actually, in my research, I studied old and new commentaries. I studied everything I could on Proverbs 31. And one commentary I came across, I took pictures of it. It said, this is a passage that's often read to women on Mother's Day. And he goes, and I'm the first to admit there are women out there that shouldn't receive this honor. And I thought, who? Why should a woman not receive this honor? Because God can't redeem their story too. I mean, I was mad when I read that. It really made me angry. And I said, no, we're changing that thinking, because I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah, really. And I mean, I mean, of course, you've got Lauren and I, 2 women, so we don't have a man kind of putting in his 2 cents, but And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. It's just, I think that a man has to be, in his marriage, in our marriages. I mean, there's got to be back and forth. There's got to be mutual respect,
Right.
and we even have talked about when Peter talks about the weaker vessel, that it's actually the outrigging of the vessel. He was a fisherman, so it was the outrigging of that vessel, and it was the rudder. It was what kept the boat on target,
Right.
and what kept the boat afloat in a
Yeah.
storm.
Well,
And
I think it relates to, I mean, even if I don't even go into this in my book, but when we talk about Ezer Kenegdo, helpers suitable, understanding what Eve and the wife is, what our biblical, what biblical womanhood is truly, according to Torah, even, we were taken from the side prior, there is no hierarchy in the creation. A lot of people will say, well, Adam was created first, so he's in charge. Well, there's different ways to understand that. And I do talk a little bit about Ezer in the book, because we talk about strength. And when we get to one of the chapters, I'll go into it a little deeper about what that looks like. But I think our position as women is definitely to share our, women's intuition. You never hear it called a man's intuition, but it's our, if Adam was taken from earth to cultivate and protect and steer the garden, we were taken from his rib. So if you're going to follow God's pattern, then our position is to cultivate, protect, and steer the garden from which we were taken, which would be man, which would be our husband. So,
right. That's a good point.
There's definitely some patterns in there. And I think that this Proverbs 31 acknowledges that. And I will say too, as a Christian, as a believer, I do believe everything in the Old Testament points to Yeshua, our Messiah, including Proverbs 31.
Right.
So,
and you do a beautiful job of showing that.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's jump in. So I'll give you some nuggets about this. So we kind of talked about this in the church. Women often view Proverbs 31 as hard to live up to. Even Shonda says she's hard to live up to. I don't see how anyone could be that person. And I'll even take it further. What if you're not married? What if you don't have children, right? What if you're a barren woman and you can't have children? What if you're a widow? Like, does Proverbs 31 not apply to you anymore? And so, I had those questions as well. Like, how does this apply to women? Right. Because it's not, it's not just that married.
We're all in different places.
Right. Especially in 22nd century or 21st century. And so, I wanted to overcome some of that, but also in the Jewish faith, Proverbs 31 is actually sung over the women of the house as a blessing. And so when they begin Shabbat and she lights the candle, part of the celebration and opening of Shabbat is for the men to sing this song, this hymn, heroic hymn over the women of their home. And so what a difference. Like in the church, it's held up to us as a standard, like you can't do this. But in the Hebrew thinking, she's told every week, look how you do this. Look at what a woman of valor you are. And so
it's affirmation of it.
Oh, strong affirmation. And so I called it a heroic hymn. And so what a heroic hymn is, in the Bible, there are passages that are basically sung over the returning warriors, or sung about the men who go to battle. The one I always mention is when King Saul and David returned from war, and the women flood into the streets and they're singing, and they say, oh, Saul has killed 1,000, but David killed tens of thousands. That's a heroic hymn. That's them singing the praise of their battle. And so for it to be called a heroic hymn, and all those references to her strength, and we'll see in here, how it does have that military theme. we'll understand more how it is a heroic hymn that God sings over us. He sings this over us as well. It is an acrostic poem, and that means that every verse from Proverbs 31:10 through 31:31, I hope I got that right, begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it starts with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and it goes through. We don't see that because we're reading the translation in English. And so, the words are rearranged and smoothed out so we can hear it. But if you look at it in Hebrew, you can actually go down and look at the first letter of every verse and go right through the alphabet.
It does, yes.
It does. The other thing is it's a chiastic poem, which means verse 10 parallels verse 31, and they parallel until you get to Nun, which is letter Nun. And that's the main idea of this entire passage. So Nun does reference, it's the verse that says her husband sits at the city gates, and when
he sits with the leaders of the land.
Right. So he sits with the leader of the land. So for a Hebrew acrostic, it's still, the main point is still the husband, right? Because it is a ancient Near East passage, and as great as she is, the main point is her husband. And I'll share this when we get to Nun. But also, I'm always going to ask you, what does this teach us about Messiah? And so what should be the main point of our life, right? Our husband, our bridegroom, who sits at the city gates, which was the epicenter of life. Like everything revolved around the city gates. So what is our main focus in the life, in our life, right? It should be that our bridegroom receives honor in the center of our life. So that's chiastic. And then Lori says she writes acrostic poetry. A lot of people, you could use, I think in the book, I talk about how we learn to memorize the planets, right? Or people, the word frog, right? Fully rely on God. They use those first letters as ways to memorize a poem or a point or something. And so what I didn't mention is, as part of the acrostic, it in Hebrew, every Hebrew letter has an image behind that letter, a picture, a pictographic. If you think about Chinese, or if you hieroglyphics, those were pictures, right? So our language started, and we talk about this in the first chapter. That's why go ahead and read that chapter as well. But our language started as paintings on a wall of a cave. Man wanted to talk about the buffalo that hunted, and so he would draw big scenes of herds of buffalo, right, or herds of cattle that he would hunt. And I'm going to draw something real quick because I always do this. And, after a while, it gets a little tedious drawing that herd of buffalo. And so he then began to draw maybe just a simple image of a cow, right? And you might have to squint, but, here's the ears and here's the horns.
Right.
And, here's the cow face. You could even put a little ring on the end of his nose so you could carry the oxen and lead him. And so maybe, after time, he got tired of drawing all the herds and began just doing the oxen. Well, over time, through the development of alphabet, letters, everything else, this eventually became a letter A, right? Yeah. And so the pictographic behind letter A in Hebrew, which is Aleph, stayed the same. So Aleph is an ox. It's still an ox.
Right.
And in Hebrew, it's gone on to develop to primarily it means God now, because nothing was before God, and nothing comes before letter Aleph. And there's other symbolism behind the letter that makes us think of God the Father.
And then numeric value and all of those
number
things.
One, right? Yeah, that's the other thing. The letters, Hebrew doesn't have a numbering system, and so they've assigned numeric value to each of the letters. So Aleph is number 1, and God is, our God is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. And so we talk about that. And so that's some of the basics as far as, kind of a mindset. This is interesting to know these things, because now you can begin to see how that writer incorporates the images of the letter. I mean, the images are an ox, a house, there's a snake, right? There's a fishing hook, there's a door. And so how do these images show up in the passage? And so those images, think about what we use acrostics. We use acrostics to help us memorize. Like, I want to memorize, and think about how important memorization is to the Hebrew mindset, right? I've got to memorize this passage of scripture. What better way than to use the Hebrew alphabet and the imagery behind the letters? Because the imagery, the pictures of those letters, show up in the verses. We don't see it because we're reading in English, but when we do the word studies and we see how it's tied together, we're like, of course, it makes sense. Like, I'm going through a marriage here. Okay, the first 3 verses are the marriage ceremony, and then the next verses are where she lives and works in her home, and the last section is how she's honored. And I mean, everything in there, when you know the imagery of the letters, you're like, of course, it totally makes sense. So,
and in the introduction, you also bring up the word for father, Av or Ab.
Right. So the images, and I'll probably.
No, I've always learned it too, Av, because the bet can have a V sound.
V, right. Bet, and Yud has different sounds depending on the usage. Think about, Spanish. I think Spanish is the easiest one. There's no J, so they use the Y, and that is sometimes a V sound versus a hard B sound. So it's just the translation. It's that the original language is going to have the V sound. We use,
they use a dot there if it's a V, and it's very interesting. It's all very interesting. But
so what I mentioned in there is, a lot of, and I will say, a lot of people do not believe in the imagery of the letters. They do not think it had anything to do with the Bible being written. Okay, I'll give you that to some extent. But this is the imagery. These are the words. These are the letters that Moses, King David, Solomon, this is the alphabet they would have used.
Right.
So this is the earliest form of the alphabet. It predates any influence of Syria, any Babylon, all of that. And so this would be the original ancient text writings. Then Israel went into captivity, Babylon and Syria, and they spent time in Persia. And that's where the Aramaic and the Semitic influence came. And they took that. And when they returned to Israel, the shapes of the letters changed. Like Aleph right now is a very block style. And so that came from the Syrian and the Persian influence. The words are different, just like we've incorporated in English letters from outside cultures. They did too. And so when you look at today's modern Hebrew, and Hebrew, quite frankly, was a language that was almost gone.
Right.
Because they spoke in Aramaic and different language that influenced it. Hebrew really became a language of the priests in the temple. And it was not the common, like Jesus, although he read Hebrew and he understood Hebrew, when he was with his friends, he likely spoke Aramaic, which has the same alphabet. Aleph is still the same first letter. So there's that. And so, yes, I agree. Today's Hebrew looks nothing like the ancient language. However, I'm looking at languages that probably Moses, David, and the early Torah was likely written in, because Torah was established before they went into, captivity.
Babylon.
Right.
I mean,
they had that.
And so many things changed when they came out of Babylon,
Right.
because even it became, the ruling people were now the Pharisees, the rabbis, they were that even changed. That's where we get Judaism. So,
Right. Right.
because they became the ruling people. But it's very interesting, all the history, and you can learn a lot. And even in, like you said, even within the alphabet and understanding. And from my understanding, they even teach this to their children, that their children get worksheets that have the letters and the number and the picture, just like we would give our kids
a worksheet. Yeah, because now they are trying. I mean, Hebrew is, the remnant is trying to reestablish itself, and even, they when a boy or a girl is bat mitzvahed or bar mitzvahed, the goal is to teach them Hebrew so that they can read the Hebrew and they see the original language. So
right.
That's why it's important. So anyway, we'll get back to Abba or Ab.
Yes.
So the imagery behind those letters, Aleph or Aleph, Aleph is an oxen, right? And so here's the cool thing about Hebrew. It's not just a letter or a number, but there's all this figurative information that's packed into those letters that you still consider, right? So Aleph is an ox. Well, what do we know about oxen? They're strong. Okay.
Yeah.
They
were used for work.
They're used for work. They're service animals, right? They serve their master. They were the animal that was used as a sacrifice. When it talks about the bull being sacrificed especially on the Day of Atonement, it was an oxen. And so when you look at that letter, all of that imagery is built into that letter. Like, I'm not just saying apple, right? Oxen, oxen. But I also have to remember all of that: strength, service, sacrifice. All of that is built in. Number one, all of that. So
leader,
So Abba is, the first letter in the name Father. And so he is the man who is the strength of the strength. He's the strong person in our home, right? He's the head of our house, that kind of thing. Well, Bet or Bait, it rhymes with mate, Bait is a house. And that it's actually remained. So here's a cool thing. A lot of people say, well, that imagery doesn't apply, but yet some of the letters are actually words. And so Bait is the word house.
Right.
And that's the imagery of the letter. And so our Father is the strength of the house. And so, we're able to see it. The women is M. It's the root Amen comes from M. So her pictographic, or our pictographic, is Aleph, strong, right? We're strength. And Mem is waters. And so the woman is strong waters. But if you think of the waters of the womb, right? And the water come from, and Mem usually means come from or come down from. So he's the strength of the house, but we're the strong waters of the house. And so all of the imagery that comes with that, giving birth, living waters, we're the teaching, we're teaching and setting the tone of our children and our home, cleansing, all of that is packed into women. So Father and Mother.
And you even made me think of, Jesus even said, in my Father's house, because that's exactly what that symbolism is, Father's house.
Right.
Aleph, Bet.
Aleph, Bet.
So, yeah, and what does he tell us? I mean, and it was like the patriarch's house. It was and that's where you found safety. It's where you found protection. It's where someone who would defend you.
Yes.
I mean, that patriarch was the person who took care of his extended family.
Right.
And that's who God the Father is. He takes care of his family.
Right. And the church is, your reference, it's the house of David or the house of Saul or whomever. The head of the house is identified by that. And so to say the house of God, Bethel, the house of God. And think about it too. We'll get into this when we get to Bet, but when we become believers, we are members of God's family. And so he's the head. He's the strength, right? He's our father. Right. So there's so much to it.
You have been learning this though over the years, because I don't think you mentioned, but not today, but you have mentioned it before, but you started out by doing Passover with your mom and your other family members because of the holidays and a divorce in the family.
Right.
So this came early on in your life.
The Jewish the introduction to the Jewishness of it. My kids say, I was raised in a Christian home. My family was divorced, and we put the fun in dysfunction, all of that. But I can say, of everything, regardless of the chaos, I very much have vivid memories of my mother reading her Bible, of my mother sitting in her chair. And I say this in the book, she and no doubt that my parents were believers, like is the way, shifting and the way it's definitely evolved into things. I had no question they believed in God. And we were exposed to, at the very least, Passover very young. I mean, I remember doing Passover at the church. I remember doing Passover at the home. We did it. We didn't do it every year, but it was definitely, it was often enough that I'm very familiar with it. And that is something, of all the feasts, that is something that my husband and I still have celebrated. My kids understand Passover. We have done it in our home. I'm looking forward to doing it again, So that, if anything, that is the introduction of it. And seeing Messiah in Passover, I don't know how it's missed, but taking that a step further, seeing Messiah now in Proverbs 31, seeing Messiah in the alphabet, seeing, if he's the word, he's the fulfillment of every letter as well. So there's
yes.
Mm-hmm. Shonda does Passover too. Yes, I love Passover. Yeah. So I wanted to share too. I think this is interesting. Proverbs 31, it starts out, I'll read a little bit here. It says, these are the words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. And so a lot of people have gone back and forth. So this is what the mother has said. Mom has said this to her son, who happens to be the king. It says, oh, what my son, oh, son of my womb, waters. O son of my vows, do not give your strength to women, the women that are going to destroy the king. It's not for the kings, O Lemuel, for the kings to drink wine and for rulers to desire strong drink, for they forget, and you're gonna forget what's decreed. And so she goes on, and she's like, listen, son, don't go looking for these women that you're going to have to give up a part of yourself to. I need you to go find this kind of woman. This is the woman that I want you to find. And isn't that like every mom? Like, don't we always pray over our kids' spouses? From day one, we're praying for whoever it is that they meet. And so this mom is saying, listen, son, you need to go find this woman. So there's some more nuggets in here. So Proverbs is the book of wisdom, and wisdom is personified as a woman. It's introduced at the very beginning, Lady Wisdom, and there's a contrast between the woman of folly and Lady Wisdom. And then here at the very end is this mother imparting these wise words. Listen, of every woman that I would pray for you, this woman of wisdom is who I want for you to have. This is what she looks like. A, she does this. B, she does this. C, she's this. And she goes down the alphabet so he'll remember it. And we'll get into that. It's amazing. Well, people go back and forth who King Lemuel is. There's no specific, he is absolutely this person. But one of the commentaries suggests that it is Bathsheba giving advice to Solomon. And think about it, Solomon had how many wives, right?
No.
So at some point, maybe Bathsheba was like, listen, son, you got to stop, giving away your wisdom and having these women take your wisdom. They're leading you astray. Wouldn't it make sense for Bathsheba to come and give him advice? Like, this is the kind of woman you need to find.
Right.
And Lemuel, they think that was a like a pet name or something. So I don't know. I haven't been able to confirm or deny. But a lot of the Jewish commentary do believe that this is Bathsheba. Well, so this is another thought within the Jewish community that we completely miss.
Right.
In the church. A lot of commentary suggests that Proverbs 31 is a commentary of the book of Ruth. I mentioned that who can find a woman of excellence? Who can find this Ishet Chayil? The only other woman in the Bible that is described as Ishet Chayil is Ruth. Boaz says that she is a woman of excellence. And when you know what these verses mean in Hebrew and you know the imagery of the letters, when you begin reading the book of Ruth, you're like, oh, that's Aleph, that's Bet, that's the statement of Nun, that's this. And the language is the same. So that's a thing in Hebrew thinking.
Yes.
If I say this, it should remind you of this and it should pull you back to it. And so there's a lot of language that is used in Proverbs 31 that, if not a direct quote, it's a very, very similar thought process to the book of Ruth. Now think about it. So think about this. We don't think about this. This is so cool. Okay, Ruth. Who's Ruth? What do we know about Ruth? What do you know about Ruth?
She was a Moabite, and she was
Gentile.
married. She was married to one of Naomi's sons.
Yep.
So one of two women who were married to each of his sons, and so, and when Naomi then lost her husband, so she lost her son, so they were kind of destitute. They had no redeemer. They had no one to take care of them, to help them. So they decided to move and go and find their kinsman redeemer, basically.
Right. And through the process, Boaz accepts this Gentile woman. Naomi and her are definitely, working together and getting Ruth positioned.
She was loyal. She was very loyal.
So the very end of the book of Ruth, it says, and now Ruth has this baby. And so a lot of people think that Ruth was probably barren. And we talked about, the theme of being barren. The huge theme of Ruth is empty and full, empty and full, empty and full. And so Ruth had a baby. Boaz and Ruth had Perez, and then it goes through the family line, and it shows that Ruth is the great grandmother of King David. Okay. David has children. Solomon is one of his children. We don't think about this. There's no biblical evidence. And this is supposition. I mean, I don't know, but I knew my great grandmother. She was alive when I was young. I knew who she was, right? And if you think about the ages and things, there is a high likelihood that David knew Ruth. There's nothing in the Bible that says that is the case, but if she was his great grandmother, there's a high probability that she was alive, right? And so if David and Jesse definitely would have known her, that was his grandmother, right?
Yes.
And so even if David wasn't alive to meet her, Jesse knew of Ruth. Jesse probably knew Ruth and said, David, you got to know about your great grandmother. And right, it was all stories that are passed down.
Yes.
So why wouldn't David talk about his great grandmother Ruth to Solomon or Bathsheba? Bathsheba could have met Ruth and said, listen, son, if you're going to go find a woman, you've got to find a woman like Ruth, because this is the kind of woman you need to marry from A to Z. And we see, how Ruth
Right.
was a part of that. So
Yeah.
nothing in the Bible says that.
Right.
It's not
But when you look at timelines,
yeah.
because even Noah may have known Adam,
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
I think
because
he died right before. Yeah, I think he
but
was.
they lived so long that it
They
would have at
did.
least been Noah's father,
Right.
Lamech, that knew. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Lori puts in, I knew one of mine until 25 years old. So, by 25, and David took the throne at 30.
Yeah.
There's a huge, there's a high likelihood. And so the language for the language of Proverbs 31 to echo the book of Ruth would not be unheard of, because they've heard those stories, and they're only a few generations removed. They likely got it from the source.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So it's something we don't really think about, but in the timeline, and we don't know how long I don't know how long, I don't know how old Ruth was when she returned. I don't know how long she lived.
Right. But Matthew gives us that whole genealogy, and you see, I mean, that's what's so, it's a very Jewish thing that they knew their genealogy, and that they knew, the reasons why these women were mentioned. Even, I was just trying to go back and find it, but, so of course this one is all in Hebrew, but, Boaz was a father of
Perez. Obed, and then Obed is Perez, and Perez is the father of Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesse is David's father.
Right. So it's very interesting, because then they skip to Solomon.
Yeah.
And then they go the Solomon, and of course.
Yeah. So I mean, Solomon is David's son. Right. So why wouldn't he know of his great grandfather? Yeah. And so think of I'm looking at Ruth 4:20, 21. And to Solomon was born Boaz. So that's Boaz and Ruth. Boaz had Obed. Obed was born Jesse, and Jesse to David. And David's the last word of the book of Ruth. Yeah.
Wow.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's my my commentary. This is not anything in the Bible, but think about how long they lived, the importance of speaking the culture, telling the stories, preserving the stories of our families, the patriarchal society, all of that plays into it. Could happen. It could be the case. So definitely. So for Bathsheba to say to Solomon, look, Solomon, you've got all these wives. You've been marrying all these women. You are giving away your strength. This is the kind of woman you should marry. Marry a woman of wisdom who, and when you see as we go through Proverbs 31, I'll try to make reference to, okay, think of this like Naomi and Ruth. Like there's references of her doing selling belts to the tradesmen. That to me speaks loudly of Naomi and Ruth. So we'll kind of try to hit some of those points as well. See,
and I even love in Proverbs 31, she tells him, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. I mean, she's instructing him.
Yeah.
But she's also saying, and then find a woman who's just like this too.
Yeah.
I mean, for the rights, speak up for the rights of all who need advocates. Speak up, judge righteously, defend the cause of the poor.
Where are you reading?
That is
open your mouth and judge righteously, defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is that not Boaz?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that not? So, I mean, I think
this is the family you come from.
This is that's so good. I love that. Yeah. This is your this is your great grandmother. This is Boaz. You need to know these things. And so,
and they're very proud of who they came from, who their ancestors were and
Right.
whatever they accomplished. I mean, they talked about it. This is, oh, do you know Boaz was my great grandfather, you know? And I mean, they would have talked about those things.
Right.
It would have been made known. Everybody who knew Solomon, who knew David, would have known the story of Ruth, would have known the story of Boaz.
Yeah.
So,
especially in Bethlehem,
yeah,
that's Boaz from Bethlehem. And so for them to establish the kingdom there and the temple and everything, if you're in the line of David, then you knew who David's family was.
Right. So. It's amazing because it's not just one story. It's a story that's layered upon story and story before it and story after it. I mean, there's, it's just like, I mean, and you always say this and I always repeat it, but it's those layers and knowing and understanding who they came from. And it's all a story of redemption. I think that's what's so beautiful. It's a constant story of redemption.
I say that, and I've heard this from other teachers, if you are going to study and read the Old Testament, now that we know Messiah, then you need to ask yourself, what is God showing? How is God showing me Messiah in the Old Testament, in this passage? And so even in Proverbs 31, we have the link to kinsman redeemer, if that in fact is the true link to Ruth. So that is Messiah. But also, if you think of marriage and what marriage is, it is a shadow of our relationship with Messiah and him as our bridegroom. So keep that too. Lori said, I'm not married. Okay, that was number one question. How does Proverbs 31 apply to the women who aren't married, whether they're divorced, single, or widowed? I'm going to have guilt because I don't live up to this. Like, I'm not married, so that just takes me off the table immediately. I can't be a Proverbs 31 woman. No, because your marriage is, and even the men, I even do that when I speak. I'm like, welcome to the sisterhood, fellas, because your bridegroom, men, women, church, believers, your bridegroom is Messiah. And so if it is wise for the king to marry this woman, then it is wise for our King Messiah to marry this woman. And so we have to emulate this woman. We have to, and if our job is to make his name known at the city gates and to give him honor, right? The only way a man could have honor and sit at the city gates is because things are being taken care of at home. Yeah. Well, if it's not, the church's job is, let's take care of this so that our king can take his place on the throne. And so, so it's not just a married woman. It's the body of Yeshua fulfilling her position as the bride of Christ too. So we have to consider all of that as we read Proverbs 31.
Because, marriage was instituted by God to teach us the relationship we have with him. Right. So just because we're not married doesn't mean we can't learn that relationship through life. We can't learn the relationship with God, with the Messiah, through just our everyday life and through other relationships.
So I'll touch on this a little bit. The Ezer Kenegdo, the helper suitable, I think definitely applies here because, we were taken from man. We were placed to set the boundaries and and to preserve his spiritual aspect. If you read through Genesis, it says, man, it's not good for man to live alone. I'm giving him a helper suitable to help protect that spiritual realm. And so, so that's Eve's job. Okay. That's the church's job, because what do? We are protecting. We're the doorkeeper, and also the doorkeeper. We'll talk about that in here. The doorkeeper to the temple was a person who would stand at the door and either allow you to come into the temple or not. And doorkeepers were women. Some of the doorkeepers in the Bible are women. And we are the doorkeepers of our homes, right? We are the filter through, especially if you're a stay-at-home mom. If not, even if you're not a stay-at-home mom, moms definitely set the tone of the home. And we are responsible really for raising our kids up to, putting in place, with our toddlers,
Mm-hmm.
those earliest beliefs. And it's, our job is to propagate believers. Like that's what the Jewish life is all about. Their whole Jewish life is to reproduce our faith. And that's what we're to do. And that's what the church is to do by building disciples, reproduce our faith. And so we, being the doorkeepers, we are surrounding the church. The church is to be the doorkeepers of the faith, to introduce them to Jesus. We are the doorkeepers of our home to introduce them to, so it's a pattern that's 100% seen. And then we'll see how Proverbs 31 does the same thing. Like, this is what you're supposed to do, live it out. So, yeah.
And even you think of the Jewish family, I mean, because there were mixed marriages, it was basically said, if your mother was Jewish, you were Jewish.
Right.
And if your grandmother was Jewish, then you were also Jewish.
Yeah.
So it was really the whole faith of the family was dependent upon the mother, really.
Yeah.
And I would even say it's still that way. I mean, there's a lot of households where the mom goes to church and the father does not do. And she's the one taking the family to church. She's the one spiritually guiding her children. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a theme, a pattern that is solid. So next week, we're down to a few minutes. Next week, we're going to actually jump in. We're going to do, so please read the heroic hymn chapter. It's very little. It's everything we talked about today is in there.
Yes.
And then next week, I will share from chapter Aleph and chapter Bet.
So the first two main chapters.
So that relates to verses Proverbs 31, 10, and 11. And so we'll jump right in. We'll talk a little bit more about Aleph and the ox and Beit, the house, and we'll introduce you to the first two. So Aleph is me.
You definitely learn the Hebrew alphabet doing this.
Yeah. So you'll see some stories, and we'll get into different word studies. We'll look at different words within the text, and so hopefully it's not hard. You're welcome to read ahead if you want, but we're just going to cover 2 chapters a week. So,
yep. Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us today. And I hope you invite your friends to join us. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah.
I know you will.
Shonda was saying that's how it was in my house growing up. So Shonda's saying that our moms are usually the ones that teach us. Yeah. My mom taught me too. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you. And we will see you next week. It's time to say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hugie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.